Imagine being so skilled at deception that you could convince people to invest billions of dollars into a completely made-up fund, promising outrageous returns that were too good to be true. Well, that's exactly what one audacious con man did, running an elaborate decades-long scam that spanned multiple continents. This is the unbelievable story of John Akhah Blay-Miezah, quite possibly America's greatest fraudster. The infamous scammer managed to pay for the most luxurious cars, private chefs, and even stayed in the most fancy hotels you can imagine. Stay tuned as we uncover the astonishing depths of his cunning schemes. Before we dive into John Akhah's biggest con of all, it's important to understand his early life of crime that paved the way. From a young age, Blay-Miezah was obsessed with wealth and status, constantly studying how the rich and powerful moved through the world. His childhood spent hustling on the streets of Ghana's poorest villages gave him crucial skills in manipulation and deception. Many years ago, an African man from the poor villages of Ghana carried out one of the grandest and most ingenious financial frauds in history. Long before securing meetings with powerful leaders, he had been a king of petty scams, posing as bankers, diplomats, even claiming to be the son of influential figures, while accumulating mountains of debt he never intended to pay. John Akhah Blay-Miezah, known as the Kerosene Boy for hawking. Kerosene as a child was brilliant and driven, studying the trappings of wealth from a young age. Could you have spotted the signs that this man was a con artist from the beginning? He was jailed numerous times for his fraud schemes, only to escape through the most creative means, once faking a cardiac arrest, another time slipping away during that fake trip to withdraw funds. This creative con artist had no limits to his audacity. The real excitement began when the ever-resourceful Blay-Miezah found himself jailed once more in Ghana in the 1960s. That's when he boldly declared himself the custodian of an imaginary trust fund worth billions of dollars, kickstarting an audacious global scheme that would dupe investors across continents for decades to come. While imprisoned in Ghana, Blay-Miezah somehow managed to secure a meeting with the country's military dictator, General Achiampong. With astounding confidence and skillful lies, he spun an elaborate tale, claiming that Ghana's former president Kwame Nkrumah, on his deathbed, had entrusted Blay-Miezah with the secret location of a massive fortune worth $27 billion in gold bars, stashed in a Swiss bank vault. Blay-Miezah had been released in 1966 after Nkrumah's overthrow, having been jailed in 1963 for vaguely claiming a threat to Nkrumah's life. Do you think you could come up with a lie that is unbelievable, yet have someone fall for it completely? Incredibly, the desperate general believed this tall tale hook, line, and sinker. Seeking a miracle to rescue Ghana's flailing economy, Achiampong granted Blay-Miezah diplomatic credentials to travel the world raising funds to retrieve this entirely imaginary fortune. And thus, the Omana Ghana Trust Fund was born, a trust fund that existed only in Blay-Miezah's mind. Once Blay-Miezah had his foot in the door with that pivotal first lie, he kicked his scheme into an even higher gear. He adopted all the airs and trappings of a wealthy businessman and diplomat, surrounding himself with a roster of assistants and employees. Blay-Miezah staged elaborate waiting room scenarios where investors were made to wait for hours before gracing them with his presence. Every small detail was carefully choreographed to lend authenticity, from the traditional Ghanaian handshakes he greeted investors with, to having his personal chef cook regional delicacies in hotel kitchens. It was all part of building the aura of being a true multi-billionaire African royalty on the cusp of an enormous payout. Blay-Miezah's ability to stay completely committed to the performance at all times proved key to stringing his victims along for decades. Could you have remained fully convinced by such an immersive fraudster under those circumstances? Or would small inconsistencies have eventually penetrated the illusion? Blay-Miezah quickly set up sham offices and began recruiting investors worldwide, luring them with promises of staggering returns of 10 to 20 times their investment once the funds were accessed. With a flair for deception, he spun a web of Australian heritage, Ivy League degrees, and connections to Ghana's elite to build legitimacy. Lawyers, businessmen, even college students and widows were drawn in by his charismatic personality and the prospect of unimaginable wealth. No amount of funds raised was ever enough for Blay-Miezah's greed. He reinvested the money into an increasingly lavish lifestyle, surrounding himself with the trappings of immense wealth as proof of the fortune to come. As the Omana Ghana Trust Fund scheme escalated globally, Blay-Miezah lived an ultra-lavish lifestyle befitting a man of incredible means. He drove a fleet of the latest luxury cars like Rolls-Royces and Bentleys, hired bodyguards to bolster his aura of importance, and stayed in the most opulent five-star hotels and private villas wherever he went. No expense was spared to maintain his image as African royalty. Blay-Miezah traveled with a full-time personal chef who would prepare Ghanaian delicacies in the hotel kitchens, much to the bafflement of staff. He threw extravagant parties and surrounded himself with an entourage of beautiful women, all funded, of course, by the endless stream of investments pouring in from his unsuspecting victims worldwide. To maintain the ruse, Blay-Miezah would periodically summon his investors to upscale locations like hotels on the French Riviera or in London, claiming the funds were finally about to be released after dealing with complex banking hurdles. The hopeful investors would arrive with packed suitcases, ready to become instant millionaires once the vault was unlocked. But each time, after being wined and dined by their host, Blay-Miezah would inevitably provide another litany of excuses for the delay. New banking regulations, funds being moved between different banks, anything to string his believers along for just a little longer. He was a master at manipulating their hopes. Astonishingly, no matter how many times the release date was missed, the majority of Blay-Miezah's victims refused to see the truth. They clung stubbornly to their faith that this brilliant financial mind must have some valid reason, and that they were simply caught up in complex, logistical issues of moving billions across borders. The dream of immense wealth made them blind to the obvious signs of Obama's deception. For over 15 years, Blay-Miezah's colossal con, dubbed the Homeland Hustle by investigators, flourished on an incredible scale. At its peak in the late 1980s, he had defrauded investors out of over $200 million across Ghana, South Korea, Britain, and America. But inevitably, his unbridled greed grew too excessive, pushing the scheme's limits past the breaking point. The first crack emerged when Blay-Miezah attempted an audacious $50,000 counterfeiting scheme targeting the Deutsche Bank in Germany, a short-sighted move that first alerted authorities to his wider deceptions. As the FBI, SEC, and investigators across 3 continents began probing the so-called Omana Trust, formerly obedient investors also began voicing louder suspicions about the endless excuses. One lawyer in particular, Barry Ginsberg from Philadelphia, had reached a breaking point after years of funding the scheme but never seeing a penny return. Fed up with Blay-Miezah's runarounds, he tipped off authorities about what he feared was a massive decades-long fraud. Other investors followed, coming forward with complaints despite years of silence. For authorities, however, building a solid case against the elusive globe-trotting fraudster proved immensely difficult. Over the years, Blay-Miezah had vanished and resurfaced so many times, using a web of false identities and front companies to cover his tracks. It wasn't until fingerprint evidence from a body in Ghana in the 1990s, supposedly Blay-Miezah, after years of house arrest, could conclusively confirm his identity and death. Sadly, we would never discover the cause of his death because this is not known. Even with Blay-Miezah's demise, the lasting impact and deception of his Homeland Hustle scheme is staggering. Despite overwhelming proof that the billions in the Omana Ghana Trust never existed, a hardcore of his supporters have stubbornly refused to accept reality. Clinging to decades of fanciful promises, they believe Blay-Miezah must have had some real fortune stashed away, still waiting to be unlocked and shared with his loyal believers. It is reported that Blay-Miezah managed to scam approximately $100 million from individuals worldwide through his fraudulent operations. Beyond the financial ruin for so many victims, Blay-Miezah's sprawling web of lies and fabricated histories also dealt lasting damage to Ghana's reputation and cultural pride. His exploits played on stereotypes of African corruption, making the nation's name synonymous with get-rich-quick schemes for years after the truth came out. Ultimately, the unbelievable story of John Akhah Blay-Miezah serves as a crucial warning about the dangers of unchecked greed and the human capacity for self-deception. No matter how ludicrous the promise, there will always be those desperate enough to buy the lie, allowing con artists like Blay-Miezah to operate for shockingly long periods. As we've seen, the consequences for failing to question such obvious deceptions can be utterly ruinous. Have you ever been tempted by an offer that seemed too good to be true? What would it take for you to see through a con like Blay-Miezah's? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. And for those who got drawn into Blay-Miezah's web, what initial red flags did you miss or rationalize away at the beginning? With the benefit of hindsight, when should the alarm bells have started ringing? Share your thoughts on how even the most intelligent can fall victim to the lure of getting rich quick. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more unbelievable robber stories, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads exposing the audacious tactics of the world's greatest con artists.